Chapter 29. Brother, you don't know the whole story. Barcelona, April 24, 1993. One man's sunset is another man's dawn. The past 10 days touring Europe had been a boost to my pained, empty heart. I sat on a small balcony outside my hotel window 7 floors up, listening to my Walkman and looking out over rooftops, church spires and steeples as a huge red sun drifted below the horizon. I'd come to know the distinctive smells of many cities, and as I inhaled deeply, I decided that Barcelona's could be called Mediterranean melange. I'd been working hard with Bam Bam, and I was content knowing that our match that aired live across all of Spain that night had been excellent. The Barcelona twilight melted into night until the only glow in the sky was from a silver crescent moon and a few twinkling stars. My mind drifted to a hazy memory of Brussels, the first night of the tour, standing drunk on a corner with Bam Bam at 4 in the morning listening to some street musicians. From Brussels we went to London, where I realized by the size of the crowd waiting for me at the airport that losing the belt hadn't swayed my faithful fans one bit. I was more over than before. I laughed to myself as I remembered doing a morning talk show in London where I was supposed to promote a new WWF album featuring a sappy song I'd recorded months earlier. As horrible as it was, with a little production magic, it miraculously reached number 4 on the UK music charts. Talk about a one-hit wonder. A stuffy older man and woman hosted the talk show, and they had no clue who I was. They seemed skeptical when I told them that more than 80,000 wrestling fans had filled Wembley Stadium to see us the previous summer. They droned on about whether or not wrestling was really a sport at all. I admit to being tired and cranky, and I was even less amused when some pear-shaped bloke in a red devil outfit joined us on the set and kept poking me in the stomach with a cheesy plastic pitchfork, while I did my best to respond to their uninformed questions. During a short commercial break, I jerked his plastic pitchfork and told the startled devil that if he poked me one more time I'd shove the pitchfork up his ass. The most interesting part of the tour had been Belfast, where the dreary streets looked tired and downtrodden. British soldiers with machine guns stationed on many corners. We'd stayed at the Europa, whose claim to fame is that it's the most bombed hotel in the world. As I checked in, I was approached by a timid taxi driver who mentioned that his 2 boys were my biggest fans. He offered to give me a free tour of the real Belfast. Soon we were driving past political murals. As he showed me various bombed-out sites, we talked some. His name was Sean, he was 34. But he looked 10 years older. We passed the cemetery where only a few months before, at an IRA funeral, mourners attacked and brutally killed some spying Ulster loyalists who were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Sean gave me an Irish Catholic history of Belfast and drove me to Killer Triangle streets, which he explained were intersections where kills could be made from 3 different angles, and where people were randomly murdered all the time in the crossfire. It gave me pause when he said, "It's not so bad. Nothing like America." When he was showing me the H block, we got pulled over by an Ulster Special Police officer, and Sean broke into a sweat. He hurriedly filled me in that this officer, whom he'd seen many times before, was nicknamed Lurch by Catholics such as him, and had killed many of them. Lurch, who was about 6'5" and dressed in an all-black uniform that reminded me of an SS stormtrooper, approached the taxi suspiciously, machine gun in hand. It was a tense few minutes as Lurch questioned us. I handed over my passport while Sean explained. While Lurch ran a check on us, a terrified Sean confessed to me that he had a criminal record for gun running and that he'd done 2 years in the H block himself, where they'd worked him over pretty good. He was in it around the same time that Bobby Sands died, while on a hunger strike. But after a very long 10 minutes Lurch let us go. Sean invited me for tea at his house. While we sipped from our cups, his wife told me that one of the hunger strikers lived 2 doors down, and she explained how the death of Bobby Sands eventually led the way for some positive change in the Catholic cause. IRA prisoners were now to be treated as pals rather than common criminals. Meanwhile, Sean pulled his young boys out of the school across the street. They were shaking with excitement to meet me. They showed me their room, where magazine pictures of me were plastered all over the walls. They also told me not to worry because I was better than Hulk Hogan and I'd win back the title in no time. That night at the show in Belfast, a mixed audience of Catholics and Protestants were content to let out their aggressions watching wrestling. Many hugged me and held tightly onto my hands as I walked around the ring after my match. Sean gave me a decorated and varnished hurling stick to take home with me to Canada. I thought it was nice of him to do something like that, since money didn't come easy for him. On the drive to Dublin I found the emerald Ireland I'd hoped for, dotted with quaint moss-covered cottages and farms with sheep grazing and rolling pastures. At the show I was amazed to find an even more adoring crowd, who wrapped me in Irish flags after my match with Bam Bam. They seemed to regard me almost as a son who'd come home. Few people could imagine the life I lived. I'd come to feel like an explorer who'd traveled to far and distant lands and was loved by the people he encountered. I would never forget this breathtaking, spectacular, surreal time in my life. WCW was beginning to give Vince a run for his money on the pay-per-view side of things, although their house show attendance was horrible. Vince fought back by scheduling a new annual pay-per-view to bridge the gap between WrestleMania and SummerSlam called King of the Ring. The inaugural event would be held at the brand new Nutter Center in Dayton, Ohio, on June 13, 1993. I stayed focused and carried myself with dignity, which was appreciated by the boys and, more importantly, by the fans. As soon as Hogan had taken the belt back, house show attendance nosedived. WWF wrestlers were paid a percentage of the gate, and it made me feel good when most of the boys told me they hoped I'd get the belt back. With paychecks shrinking and pink slips looming, the discontent in the dressing room was bad enough that many who feared they were about to be sacked took it as a mixed blessing. Tito Darso, the Beverly Brothers, Earthquake, and even the pretty ring announcer, Mike McGurk, suddenly vanished. Within a couple of weeks, Duggan and the Nasty Boys were gone too. WCW was waiting in the wings with huge guaranteed money contracts. They had made overtures to Hogan over the last year or so. I wondered whether Vince had put the belt back on Hogan with such a cheap win over Yoko just to lower his stock should he decide to go to WCW. Still, former WWF names such as Rick Rude, Jake the Snake, and Psycho Sid, to name only a few, all landed WCW contracts at one time or another with lots of perks and time off. Davey was there now too, feuding with Vader. Owen had come back to work because he couldn't survive on what Vince paid him while he was hurt. Martha was pushing him hard to pack it in, and he'd applied for a job with the Calgary Fire Department. Meanwhile, he taped his knee and carried on despite the torn ligament. He took pride in the actual wrestling, but he had the same love-hate relationship with the business that I did. You can't stop talent, but, unfortunately, in Owen's case, he'd been stopped by one thing or another every time he was on the verge of a break. King of the Ring was a one-night tournament concept, and it was a good sign that my stock was rising again when Vince told me that I'd be crowned the winner. My guess was that Vince was starting to build me for what I already knew was coming, a SummerSlam showdown with Hogan, in many ways, a showdown between my fans and his. On May 24th, I was summoned to a secret photo shoot in Halifax to do promotional shots for the SummerSlam 1993. Hogan and I posed doing a mock tug-of-war with the world belt standing chin to forehead, sneering and gritting our teeth. If I faced Hogan at the SummerSlam, win or lose, I knew he'd be booed and I'd be the underdog. What didn't occur to me was that Hogan knew it too. On May 29th, Vince called me at home to tell me the big news that I was getting the belt back. What I didn't expect to hear was that he was getting ready to call Hogan and hated the thought of telling him that he was too old and tired for a company whose marketing strategy was now based around a new generation concept. Vince wanted to make Hogan into the Babe Ruth of the WWF and use him as more of a special attraction. He asked me not to say anything until he had spoken to Hogan. 10 days later, Vince called again. He warned me that he was about to tell me something that would make me really angry. Hogan was flat out refusing to put me over, saying I wasn't in his league. Vince had decided that Yoko would be getting the belt instead. I couldn't believe that Hogan would do this to me. I remembered him shaking my hand at WrestleMania 9, and telling me he'd be happy to return the favor. Vince said he'd have one more meeting with Hogan to try to sell him on it, but if he didn't go for it, I'd work with Lawler at SummerSlam instead. Hogan didn't go for it. I wanted to believe that Vince hadn't told me the whole story, and I made up my mind to confront Hogan as soon as he dropped the belt to Yoko. I'd wait till then, because it didn't seem right for me to change Yoko's destiny. I showed up in the dressing room for King of the Ring in a dark mood and promptly drew a blackboard cartoon of Beefcake with his face buried in Hogan's ass cheeks with a caption that read, "Be careful, Brutus, you don't want to loosen the screws in your face." Speaking of screws, I was taking my frustration out on Beefcake, which wasn't right, but I was too pissed off to know it at the time. What Hogan had done was perfectly clear to the boys, and they enjoyed the humor of my cartoon. Since Hogan rarely bothered to come into the dressing room, he didn't see it, but Beefcake sure did it and went slinking back to Hulk. But it didn't matter to me. Hogan was no longer one of the boys, and he never would be again. I was determined not only to have the 3 best matches on the pay-per-view, but 3 of the best matches of my career. Razor and I opened the show. For some reason, Pat told me not to win any of my matches with the sharpshooter, so I worked a spot with Razor where he stomped and broke my fingers as an excuse as to why I couldn't use them for the rest of the night. His work had improved a lot since the Royal Rumble, and we pulled some clever spots going into the finish, with Razor falling backward off the top and me twisting to land on top of him for a pinfall. My second bout was with Mr. Perfect. Vince hadn't done much with Kurt since he'd returned to full-time wrestling after recovering from his back injury. Kurt wanted to have a great match just to show Vince that he still could, and he did. In what many would come to rate as our greatest bout ever. Kurt and I danced a tango that left them speechless backstage. Our impromptu pre-match interview was casual and hilarious as we kidded each other about whose dad was tougher. With timing like Ginger Rogers and Fred Astaire, we worked a rugged babyface match with most of our old great spots. Just as I went for the sharpshooter, Kurt bent back my taped and supposedly broken fingers, bringing me instantly to my knees. He went for his perfect plex, honoring me by letting me kick out of his finish again. I went for a standing suplex, and we jackknifed backward over the top rope where Kurt slammed his bad back hard across the ring apron. With both of us lying on the padded floor, a grimacing Kurt rolled in first and I crawled in right behind him. Hector stepped between us long enough for Kurt to slide in and fold me up in a small package, but I managed to flip us over, pinning Kurt cleanly with a 1, 2, 3. It was a classic. Kurt beamed with pride when I shook his hand in the ring. I went backstage and watched Hogan and Yoko on a monitor. They moved in slow motion like a walrus squaring off against a hippopotamus. I rolled my eyes at how lame the finish was. Hulk proceeded to knock Fuji off the ring apron only to turn around and see a Japanese photographer in an obviously fake beard on the apron with his camera. Hulk got close and the cameraman exploded flash paper, supposedly burning Hogan's eyes. It was a disgraceful way of doing the job. When Yoko pinned him, the crowd seemed relieved it was finally over. Once Hogan got back to his dressing room, I knocked on the door and stepped in. Jimmy Hart, Dave Heckner and Beefcake were with him. I said, "Terry, I want to speak with you." We stared at each other. "You told me at WrestleMania 9 that you'd be happy to return the favor, and as I understand it, now you don't want to even work with me, you won't put me over, and I'm not in your league." Hogan stood there speechless, so I carried on. "Well, you're right. You're not in my league. On behalf of myself, my family and most of the boys in the dressing room, you can go fuck yourself." He stuttered, "Brother, you don't know the whole story." "I got the story directly from Vince," I said. "Terry, you haven't said 10 words to me since you got back almost 4 months ago. If you want to level with me, then go ahead." "I'm right here." "I can't." "Why not?" "Because you just told me to go fuck myself." "That's right, and I'll tell you again. Go fuck yourself." I turned and walked out, heading straight for the ring to wrestle Bam Bam for the main event finale of the tournament. Bammer and I had our best match ever. After 20 long minutes of Bammer bouncing me around like a basketball, I jumped on his shoulders, dove down to grab his ankles, and pinned him with a victory roll. There was no mistaking who the real champion was. At the end of the show, I stood triumphantly on the podium, wearing a purple cape and crown and holding my scepter, being interviewed by Mean Gene when, as planned, Jerry Lawler came out to attack me. Lawler recklessly bashed me with a wooden stool and then picked up the heavy wooden throne and smashed it down hard on top of me. He really hurt me. I vowed to myself that I'd get even with him later. When I finally got back to the dressing room, Vince pulled me aside to lecture me about how it was unprofessional of me to tell Hogan off. In fact, of the three of us, I felt that I was the only one who was being professional. "Winning the King of the Ring is great," I said, "but just doesn't pay the same as being the world champion, and you and I both know it." It was one of those rare times when Vince had no comeback. For perhaps the first time in my career, I really did believe that I was the best worker in the business and that I would never take a backseat to another wrestler again. The next day I was so sore that I could barely drive to the building in Columbus for TVs. As I hobbled in, Hogan came straight to me. He motioned with his big finger, "Come here." I stared at him, and he softened and asked me, "Can I have a word with you?" I nodded and off we went for a walk. Terry told me that, yes, I was supposed to win back the belt, but that when Vince changed our contest at the SummerSlam to a non-title match, he no longer wanted to do the match with me. But I clearly remembered the photo shoot we'd done with the belt and that Vince had told me I'd beat Hulk with the sharpshooter. I knew what I'd been told, and I stood firm. "Vince said that you said I wasn't good enough for you to even consider putting me over and that I wasn't in your league." "That's just not true, brother." With a mad look in his eye, Terry tugged me by the sleeve toward Vince's office and barged right in. I didn't mind. I wanted to know which one of my supposed friends was lying to me. Vince directed pleading eyes at me. And then when Hogan retold his version, Vince coolly lied to my face. I never ever said it would be a title match. I realized that there was some kind of head game going on between Vince and Hogan, and I was merely a pawn to be played with and discarded. When Hogan left the office, he had tears in his eyes. It would be a long time before I'd see him again. He finished up a few days later, and most of the boys suspected he'd be back just in time to score the main event spot with Yoko at the SummerSlam. Either way, it wouldn't be me. I had Lawler whether I liked it or not. When I made my rounds through the dressing room, several of the boys patted me on the back and praised me for telling Hogan off. Kevin Nash laughed hard as he described the look on Beefcake's face when he saw my blackboard drawing. Nash hailed from Michigan, played basketball in Europe and was now called Diesel. He was playing the role of Sean's bodyguard. At just under 7 feet, Kevin had an imposing presence that was offset by his good-natured sense of humor. I was so physically wrecked from the 3 matches the day before that the promotion gave me the day off to recover, a first. I left to clear my head. 5 hours later I got back to the hotel from a bar with a pretty girl with long black hair. In the wee hours of the morning she slept with her breasts pressed against my back. I thought of Julie, how she'd sleep with her breasts against my back just like this girl. I forgave myself as always. I wasn't so bad, I was just very stressed and lonely. As for Vince and Hogan, their actions spoke louder than their words, and even their words contradicted each other. I kept thinking, I will show them that I really am the best there is, the best there was and the best there ever will be.